Being a franchise about war, Transformers is filled with a ton of deaths throughout the multiple continuities containing the epic battle between the Autobots and Decepticons. Some of these deaths have been grotesque and brutal, showcasing both the creativity and sociopathy of the writers. In this video, we're going to be counting down the top 15 most brutal deaths in Transformers. Of course, this list is filled with spoilers galore, so if you don't want anything spoiled for you, go catch up on everything Transformers before you watch this. The only rules this time round is that only established characters can be included, not generic or filler characters. And characters can only appear in one entry no matter the continuity. With that, let's get right onto the list. The final few episodes of Transformers Armada sees the Autobots and Decepticons teaming up to take down the ever-looming threat of Unicron. However, a few bots decided to pledge allegiance to the Planet Eater, thinking there was no way Unicron would ever be defeated. One of these bots was Thrust, who would pay dearly for his decision. When announcing his true allegiance, Thrust was cornered by his ex-leader Galvatron, who scared him enough to cause him to back away and fall into a gap between Unicron's armor. Galvatron then told him how much he had screwed up as he and the audience watched Thrust slowly be crushed by the shifting armor, before he simply popped with a scream of anguish. Ow. But Galvatron don't give a fuck. Last Stand of the Wreckers is not your usual Transformers comic, and right off the bat it wanted to let you know exactly what you were in store for. Though the comic introduced us to a cast of zany and charismatic bots who we thought we'd be spending the whole comic with, it very quickly showed us it meant business by killing off the comic relief for the group, Rotorstorm. When the Wreckers arrive on Garrus 9, they almost immediately run into the fearsome Overlord, who they have a nice conversation with. Rotorstorm cracked a joke, trying to lighten the tension by shouting "Wreckers, combine!" Overlord began laughing, and everything looked like it was going to be okay. Until Overlord blew Rotorstorm's brains out all over his teammates. Yeah, things basically went downhill from there for the Wreckers. Beast Wars was a show that contained a lot of death for its cast due to the constant appearance of new toys. Some characters were killed off without much attention, some received epic deaths, and some were upgraded into the new and impressive Transmetal forms. One of these characters was Tarantulas, who managed to survive a majority of the show. This was until the episode Other Victories, where Tarantulas' backstabbing and scheming were his downfall. When he captured the powerful Tigerhawk, he attempted to reprogram the Maximal to work for him by expelling the Vok influence from his body. The beam he used instead took out 2 actual Vok from his body, which then possessed him. He panicked, shooting at them, but all this managed to achieve was aiming the beam at himself, and it opened fire on him, overloading Tarantulas with energy and causing him to explode quite horribly. This show was hardcore. Aside from further pissing off movie critics, the only thing Dark of the Moon served to do was kill off all of the Decepticons at the end of the movie. One of these horribly murdered Decepticons was the newly introduced Shockwave, a character incredibly hyped up during publicity and advertisements for the film, only for him to do pretty much nothing in the movie except menace Optimus a bit. Him being a minor character didn't mean he couldn't have a gruesome death, however, as he and Optimus met once again in the final battle of Chicago at the climax of the film. And after he was pathetically damaged by some human forces, Optimus punched out his abdomen and then tore his eye out. I think you can actually count on your fingers how many minutes Shockwave lasted. One of the most tragic deaths of More Than Meets the Eye is the luckless Pipes, who met his end at the hands of Overlord after the Decepticon broke free from his prison on board the Lost Light. Poor Pipes had nothing but crap happen to him during his short-lived time on the ship, what with him being shot by Fortress Maximus and infected with Farmer's Red Rust virus by the infected Dent. His bad luck finally undid him when he was the first to encounter Overlord, as the merciless Decepticon stomped him to bits when the Phase 6er commenced his rampage on board the Lost Light. Pipes managed to transform and sound the alarm whilst holding his chest so that his spark wouldn't fall out. He then collapsed in his own pile of blood, passing away. It was a horribly sad and brutal fate for such an adorable character, and further proof that Overlord is a heartless bastard. One of the most unexpected and shocking deaths in Transformers came during the first few minutes of Age of Extinction, where the audience is treated to a scene where the new anti-Transformer group Cemetery Win goes around hunting any remaining Autobots at large with the aid of Lockdown. In this scene, we watch them go after Ratchet, and though the Autobot puts up quite the chase, he is eventually brought down by human weapons and interrogated by Lockdown for Optimus Prime's location. Of course, he doesn't give it up, and so Lockdown plunges his weapon into Ratchet's chest and tears his spark out without remorse. Ratchet went out in a heroic yet brutal fashion, and would leave apparently about 50% of my comment section scarred for life. Going back to More Than Meets the Eye now, the original character Ambulon was introduced early on in the series, being a medic the Lost Lighters came across at Delphi, where the aforementioned Red Rust virus was unleashed. He would later become a member aboard the ship, though, much like Pipes, found himself having a particularly gruesome end come a few issues later. Ambulon was unlucky enough to be selected by Farmer to be used in a medbot competition between he and Ratchet, and whoever could fix their subject would win, the subject being First Aid and Ambulon. Farmer then sawed Ambulon in half, lengthwise. This death occurred in a similar fashion to Lockdown's death in Edge of Extinction, except that Ambulon didn't deserve it, and the visuals here are gruesome. It was a disturbing end to the poor Ambulon. Farmer would later receive his comeuppance, however. Karma, glitch! The Scavengers are an interesting group of bots from More Than Meets the Eye who show up every now and then. In their debut story in issue 7 of the comic, Croc, Misfire, Flywheels and Crankcase found themselves on the planet Clemency, where, after finding Fulcrum, they encountered the Decepticon Justice Division. Throughout More Than Meets the Eye, we witnessed the ferocity of the DJD, but this issue saw them making their first appearance and introducing themselves to the audience. This involved Tesserus grabbing Flywheels with his mini arm things and shoving him into the grinder in his chest. You can imagine what happens next. The rest of the Scavengers didn't really seem to care afterwards though. They were more concerned with what they could scavenge. While the DJD continued to show how brutal they were throughout the rest of the series, it was this first encounter with the Scavengers that was the peak of their brutality. Well, except for one other scenario, but we'll get to that later. The Fallen made an appearance in the second Transformers movie, allegedly serving as the big bad for the entire thing. I mean, his name was in the title. Despite this, the Fallen had about as much of a role in the plot that rivaled that of Shockwave's in Dark of the Moon, as he didn't really do that much until the end of the movie, attempting to use his Star Harvester to harvest the sun. Of course, the newly resurrected Optimus Prime wasn't going to let that happen, and after beating the slag out of Starscream and Megatron, he turned to the Fallen. The two had a truly epic battle, no, I'm just kidding. Prime jumped the poor guy, shouting the ever-quotable line of "Give me your face!" and then took what he wanted before plunging his fist into the Fallen's chest. Safe to say the Fallen had fallen, and he couldn't get up. Oh yeah, it gets worse. If you thought Rotorstorm was bad, the poor Pyro met an even more gruesome fate in Last Stand of the Wreckers, though lasted a bit longer than his Wrecker comrade. Throughout the comic, Pyro constantly tells his teammates how he had envisioned his death. Going out in a blaze of glory in front of Optimus Prime, the bot he idolized more than anyone in the entire universe, hence the similar appearance. However, Pyro's death wasn't quite as exciting as he had imagined it. Instead, he met his end when the Wreckers found themselves trapped in a room surrounded by angry Decepticons with limited time to escape. Someone needed to fend off the Decepticons, and that someone was Pyro. The bot bravely sacrificing himself for the others. When the doors opened, he lasted a whopping 5 seconds before he was torn limb from limb by the angry bots. But hey, at least he died saving his friends. That's gotta count for something, right? After 3 films of the two clashing, with both dying at some point, the final battle between Optimus and Megatron in Dark of the Moon looked to be an epic one. The climax of Dark of the Moon saw Chicago ravaged by an intense battle between the Decepticons and the newly arrived Autobot forces, and after he took care of the traitorous Sentinel Prime, Optimus turned to Megatron to face him one last time. This was it, their final battle. Except it was less of a battle and more of a slaughter. Megatron didn't even have time to fight back as Optimus beat the living slag out of his foe, before lodging his axe in his neck and tearing it and Megatron's entire spine out. Ouch. Not satisfied with the face he had just been given, Prime then proceeded to shoot the crap out of Sentinel Prime for good measure. Have you noticed a trend here with the majority of the brutal movie deaths being courtesy of Optimus Prime? But we're not done just yet. Transformers Sins of the Wreckers was a fantastic sequel to the already amazing Last Stand, though somehow managed to be an even bleaker and darker comic. The comic also saw the appearance of the Chimericons, Transformers who could transform into beast modes that were working for tarantulas. When the Wreckers first arrive on Earth in search of Prowl, it doesn't take them long to run into these Chimericons. One of the first they battle is Polar Claw, the polar bear who appeared in the first issue of the comic. When Guzzle got his hands on the bot, he tore him in half and then proceeded to drink the energon spilling from his mangled corpse. Ugh. One last one from the movies, Grindor from Revenge of the Fallen was the poor bot who everyone thought was Blackout but actually wasn't. The only time he appeared was in the awesome forest battle scene early on in the film, in which, in an attempt to protect Sam, Optimus was ambushed by Megatron, Starscream and Grindor, and the four engaged in an epic battle. Optimus fought ferociously, tearing off Starscream's arm and beating him with it and stabbing Megatron's leg. Though as we all know the battle would not turn out in Prime's favour, he didn't go out before jumping atop Grindor's shoulders and using his energon hooks to tear his face in two in a gruesome and brutal fashion. Though I feel bad for Grindor, that was frickin' sweet on Prime's behalf. Notice how a few of these choices are from Sins of the Wreckers or Last Stand? Nick Rush and James Roberts are the king of horrible and brutal deaths. God knows what goes on in their heads. Sins of the Wreckers promised that not all of the Wreckers would survive the story, and that became fairly obvious near the final two issues, when the Wreckers had their final confrontation with tarantulas. All was revealed during these issues, such as Roadbuster's horrifically violent past being caused by a shrunken down tarantulas in his head, who served as a literal voice in his head for many years. When the Wreckers had to escape the spider, Roadbuster decided to make a sacrifice, ramming tarantulas off a building, asking Springer to remember him as a friend, not as a murderer. Roadbuster emerged from the rubble, seemingly fine, until the voice in his head returned. And then Tarantulas, who had shrunken down in his head once again, grew to full size and obliterated his head. The illustration and context of the scene made this death absolutely horrifying, and one of the most gruesome and shocking deaths in all of Transformers. But there's still one to go. But before we get to number one, I thought we should take a look at some honourable mentions. Cue the music! You wanna make the nation that the other I play with you only have you how to negotiate plans like the night transform and tear but then you feel that it's a mighty and expect the machines in the team players instead of the key that's more like red bird red high shots and star screams and blows so cheap more like oh that's out to the sport. And finally, we reach number one, with a death that to this day still shocks me. Our final pick takes us once again to more than meets the eye. In issue 35, after the Lost Light's disappearance, Trail Cutter, First Aid, Mainframe and Bluestreak landed their shuttle on the planet of Ofsted 17, in which they came across the injured body of a Transformer. Trailbreaker immediately volunteered to assist the bot by donating some of his energon, though the group soon found out that the bot was in fact the Voss of the Decepticon Justice Division. You see where this is going? Still, Trail Cutter insisted he help the injured bot, and the second Voss was brought back online, he attacked the Autobot. Trail Cutter managed to hide himself in one of his panic bubbles as the others ran for help, only to find that a second member of the DJD resided within the bubble, Kaon. The next we see of Trail Cutter is horrifying, for when his teammates return, all that is left of the Autobot is a torn up corpse and severed head, with Kaon tearing out his brain module just as the others arrive. Though Bluestreak, First Aid and Mainframe attempt to reason with the two DJD members, Kaon simply crushed Trail Cutter's brain module against his force field, and then the two teleported away, leaving the Autobots and us with a traumatizing experience we will soon not forget.